informal sector in Africa is very important. The idea is that APRM could propose a new approach to the informal sector. I think also that we must reflect on changing our paradigm or approach to the informal sector. I mean that the challenge is not to formalize the informal sector, but to help the informal sector create health and value. Première chose.
Right, firstly, I would love to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to be amongst you and to share with you the results of an experience or a study, because I participated in dozens or many of these studies, and I am fortunate for that. So I'd like to firstly also say a word about this family. This family, the APRM, is a huge ambition, it's a huge idea, and as we know, we are a huge family. And the last time that I had the opportunity to visit Johannesburg, and the APRM was together with someone who helped us to come up with the report with two people that were very important, and they were dissidents, and they have now left us. And I believe that there was Mr. Abdenour from Algeria. He has left us now, and Mr. Leopold Donfak Sokank, a constitutionalist from Cameroon, that has also left us. My presentation is about 4 points, and I'm going to try to go through them very quickly. The first point, it's where I'm going to express my frustration towards the fact that we have not got the capacity to benefit from the potential that we have in Africa as far as entrepreneurship is concerned. There's a paradox between this entrepreneurial sector and the informal sector, and that is the first point. So it's a huge frustration that I feel towards this. Secondly, I'm going to reflect very quickly upon a certain number of solutions that seem to be incomplete as far as the problem of the informal sector. Then I will present some of the challenges, notably at an institutional level, and that takes us to the formalization or organization and monitoring of the sector. Then I'm going to present some recommendations that will take us to the reflection of this informal sector in the continent. So I was saying that I feel a huge frustration, and why is that? Because after a few years working in this mechanism, I'm always asking myself, why do young people work in a garage in America manage to work in an informal sector to create Microsoft, while a young man who sells in the Tunisian streets is pushed to commit suicide, and this will lead to what has been called the Arab Spring winter. So why is this lack of capacity for us to take forward these activities in the informal sector? Then why is it that in Africa we are able to resist climate and demographic changes in order to ensure that we have some dignity for our citizens and thus allow them to have access to maximum economic and social rights? Why is it that after the shocks of economic liberalism and neoliberalism, is it that we continue to take refuge in the informality? I was talking about a frustration, so here is the first term. When we think of the attitudes and the behaviors at the entrepreneurial level in Africa, we talk about behavior, we talk about attitudes, and if we compare this in terms of the global entrepreneurship, we see what happens with the youth. But when we look at the entrepreneurial ecosystem, we see that Africa is very far from the average, the world average, and this is the frustration that we have amongst the young ones. And the informal sector does not allow for competition that also creates a space for this economy. And many times we do not respect workers' rights as well as human rights. And then, of course, this informal sector, and when we talk about informality, we also talk about the formal sector because there are also informalities in this formal sector. So this is what we have in terms of these tables, these graphs, where we have the firms that are competing against unregistered or informal firms, as well as the firms that are identifying practices of competitors in the informal sector as a major constraint. So this is a huge challenge. So there's a huge entrepreneurial thirst. There's an informal sector that it's also intertwined with the formal sector and vice versa. So in the informal sector and this economy, this informal economy, is still a very important sector in Africa and in the world. So this importance of this sector or economy that are informal mean that Africans will depend largely on an economy of survival, and this also maintains complex relationships. So this informal economy also means that the public policies are distorted. They are based on an analysis which is not perfect, analysis which is of the reality, and that they apply only part of it. So this informal economy means that we are in a vicious circle with a certain feeling of injustice and of poor fiscal revenues, and this leads us, of course, to weak capacities on the part of the state in order to deliver what they should be delivering. What are the solutions? One travels, and like I said, I've been to many African countries. So these solutions, of course, there's the enthusiasm for doing business, as well as a sort of a competition for us to simplify the procedures. And this is, to a certain extent, a good thing. But one should not only simplify these procedures, we should attract foreigners or foreign investors first, and that is in preference to the domestic investors. We are also wanting to please international partners like the World Bank and the IMF. There's also a sort of a sense to showcase the capital. There's an imbalance between the capital and the rest of the country. And I could talk to you about Senegal, about Guinea, about any other country. What happens in the capital is different to what happens in the rest of the countries. We say that you create a business in 48 hours in the capital, and it takes a week to come to that capital. It is also not important. It's important also not to forget that there's a need to protect the rights of different partners, and this is not a simple business environment. Another solution, which is quite frequent, is this manichaeism, which is either against or for the informal sector. So while some consider that this informal sector is a sort of a cushion of the economic modernity, on the other hand, others believe that this informal prevents and delays this modern economic space. Another comment is that the decentralization that we see taking place in Africa is often associated to the harassment of small traders. Lastly, in one of my missions to one of these African countries, I can't really say, but we resorted to the informal sector to find out who were the authorities at local level that would allow and were supporting these small traders. I think we should neither fight nor glorify this informal sector. We should try and understand it in order to provide appropriate responses. There is also another conclusion or another statement, and that is that there's an obsession with measuring and reducing informality. And a lot of effort is being devoted to measuring what is qualitative and trying to explain rather than understanding the logic of all actors. Another important point is the complexity of the intertwining of the economic, social, cultural, political, environmental sectors. Another problem is sort of mimicrying, and that means that regional institutions, they often create same structures. As for instance, if you go to different countries, what we see is that we insist on creating the same institutions in all the countries, and it is important for us to see that if we do not integrate, we need to integrate not by replicating the same institutions, but by making them work together. Cooperation, integration is important. And we also try to see that, or rather, we are witnessing a kind of a breakdown of the official and the institutional. So there are other very real obstacles that are persistence. I'm not mentioning all of them. There are many others, but at this point in time, I'm going to be telling you about what I found in the different countries that I visited. At institutional level, thank you. So we have a sort of an institutional inflation, so there are too many agencies and authorities and ministries, and then this gives rise to interventions that are not coordinated, and of course there's no coordination between the technical and financial partners as well. And of course this is also a constraint for democracy. There's also a lack of coordination between the agencies and all the governmental structures. There's also a rivalry between individuals and agencies, and there's a lot of bureaucracy, and there's also, kind of trade-offs between central power and regions.
There's also the institutional accent and a lack of targeting at the institutional level. There's also a lack of resources and capacity. And finally, there's some corruption and the perversion of relationships as well between the society and the state. And finally, a denial of informal institutions. And here, statistics in Africa are rather silent around this informality in these institutions. Some recommendations regarding the APRM. I think we need to give more space to the informal economy, as well as the various levels, whether continental, national, and local. We've seen difficulties met by the informal sector. I've also noticed that in the national commissions, the informal sector is very much in minority, and you might find a person in those national commissions. When you do find that one person, you may not even find that one. I think we should also think about a change of paradigm and of approach. Rather than controlling, we need to govern informal economy. The challenge being not to formalize, but rather to create wealth, defend the dignity of citizens, and gain their trust. We need to go from the duality, formal and informal, to a duality, to the things observed and the things unobserved. At the same time, we need to insist on fighting against corruption and also against the underground economy and all forms of shadow economies. The role of the state, the strategy state, as we call it, for me, this state can be a state that is decentralized. For me, decentralization cuts the citizens from the state in many cases. The state should also be very close to the state, to the citizens, in order to serve them very well. I come from a state where the state was closer to the citizens in order to police them, to control them. So, but here things are different. You need to get close to the citizens to better serve them. I think I've finished. Maybe I'll say 2 words before I end. Well, a better knowledge and a consideration of the informal economy in public policies is required. We need to think about the integration of the ILO as to their norms and methodologies with the AU. And why not include the informal economy in the calculating the GDP? This has been proposed currently by the European Union. And this would give us another outlook, another idea of the African economy. A fiscal pedagogy is also needed. It's important for the actors to understand how the whole fiscality environment works in a continuous dialogue. I think our mechanism is founded on this dialogue. And I think the APRM could be a real vehicle for this effort of education, so as to come back with a better fiscal pact in the end. Finally, we need to reflect around regulations and creating institutions in order to develop democracy within our companies. It's this democracy that will guarantee the transparency, and especially that will help to fight informality in the formal sector. Also, we need to think and establish about establishing institutions that will be in favor of the informal economy, the circular economy, and the economy of the common goods. I thank you. I'm sorry to be a bit long.
Karim Ben Khala, I'm from Tunisia. I'm professor at Tunis High School of Commerce. I'm the director of Doctoral School of Commerce, Finance and Economics at the University of Manouba. I've been working with APRM for a long time. In fact, I've been involved in maybe about 10 missions. And that's why I'm here. And I'm also the president of Tunisian think tank, which is Khairuddin Circle, which is one of the most important think tanks in Tunisia. And we work on questions related to governance, public policy. I choose to talk about the informal sector. The informal sector in Africa is very important. We have a lot of studies on the informal sector, but my idea is that APRM could propose a new approach to the informal sector. I will talk about 4 points. First of all, there is this kind of frustration or maybe paradox. You know that Africa has the strongest entrepreneurial potential in the world. But this potential is frustrated by the ecosystem, and that leads to the informal sector, which is doing unfair competition to the formal sector, and also depriving the state from fiscal revenues. So we have this paradox, a very huge potential for entrepreneurship, an ecosystem which is very weak, and so an informal sector which is doing unfair competition to the formal sector. Then we have second point is what I called incomplete and sometimes inadequate solutions. When you travel in Africa, you see that everywhere the ministries are working, for example, on doing business. This is a very huge issue, but I'm not convinced that doing business alone could resolve this issue of informal sector. So we have some solution that we find everywhere when we travel around Africa, and these solutions are incomplete to find new propositions for formal sector. And we have this real and persistent obstacles, notably on the institutional level. So we'll talk about these obstacles on the institutional level. And then finally, I will present some recommendations and inputs from the APRM regarding this informal sector and the challenges that the informal sector poses to the African economy. I have maybe 4 or 5 main recommendations. First of all, I think that APRM should give more space to the informal economy. When I think about APRM, I'm talking about APRM at the national level, but also at the continental level. I think also that we must reflect on changing our paradigm or approach to the informal sector. I mean that the challenge is not to formalize the informal sector, but to help the informal sector create health and value. I think also that the African states must be, let's say, more strategists on this question and more close to the citizens to better help this informal sector, which is sometimes maybe something like 70 or 80% of the inhabitants of countries. We need also a better knowledge and consideration of this informal sector. Why not, for example, take into account the value created in the informal sector in calculating the national revenue? I think also that we need some kind of fiscal pedagogy to explain to citizens what is the role of taxes, how we use taxes, and so to convince them on this, let's say, fiscal pact, which is very important in the social contract. And finally, I suggest to create new institutions dedicated to new forms of economy, circular economy, for example, and new institutions dedicated to the democracy inside enterprises and firms. So, and I think that all these propositions and recommendations could be sustained by the APRM and could be integrated in the APRM approach. I think that APRM has done a huge and a good job. The challenges right now, I think, is first of all to perpetuate what has been done. You know, there's a lot of countries that adhere to the APRM, and sometimes we feel like if it's not one shot when we adhere to APRM, its problem is to perpetuate this process. The second challenge maybe is to expand or to generalize the APRM. Some countries are still waiting to decide, and I think that we must better explain the strengths of APRM for these countries. And finally, I propose to diversify the approach of the APRM. This is the three main challenges for me: to generalize and expand, to perpetuate, and to diversify the APRM. Networking, in my case, it is networking between academics, but also between academics and practitioners, between academics and, for example, businessmen in the private sector. We need to talk to each other, to learn from each other, and this kind of manifestation is very important. Even, you know, with internet, you can exchange, but internet is not the real solution. We must meet, we must discuss, we must reflect and exchange good experiences, bad experiences too, and we must build networks between academics and professionals.